right, were y'all able to get this link to work and get signed in and all that good stuff?
I did, but I didn't, the drop-down boxes wouldn't work for me. So
Oh,
I
okay.
just went ahead
So those
and
don't work
signed up.
on mobile phones,
I
apparently.
guess, but
Okay.
you got my information that I needed.
Right.
So whoever does the deed is the United States.
I think we're through. We don't need it anymore, right?
Nah, that'll be all right.
Oh, that's all you need.
Here you go. Give that to you. Do you have something to write with? All right, so hey bud, what's going on, man? No, this is something we're going to use here in just a sec. All right, so the purpose for today's session is to talk about learning objectives and the learner-centered syllabus. So our objectives, we want to first define what a learning objective is, which I find this to be a very ironic slide, and a slide of objectives about objectives, yeah. So we want to define what a learning objective is, we want to talk about why they're important, and then I'm going to have you create or maybe revise a learning objective that you already have. There's certain things that are in the grant that I'm hired under that I need to have documented, such as who's here and are they faculty or staff, and then are they online faculty. And another one of those things is artifacts from these sessions that I'm doing. So this is just kind of a way for me to get some artifacts from you just to show what we're doing in these sessions. And also to see if you're, following what I'm, picking up what I'm putting down, so to speak.
I do have a question.
Okay.
Is this directly related to the new system that we're supposed to be all going to?
Yes.
So
Yes.
this will help us meet the
Absolutely.
objectives for that
Yes.
particular
So
system.
this is very closely related to the Quality Matters process. Yes, definitely so. Especially the first part of it, where we're going to be talking about the learning objectives, and then this is part one of a 3-part series that I'm doing. So the second and third parts also. Really the second part is where we're going to talk about the alignment, and that's really what QM focuses on, is the alignment between the objectives and the assessments and the instruction. So today, as far as QM, the learning objective stuff is more so in that arena. Then we'll talk about, we'll define a learner-centered syllabus and identify the essential components of a learner-centered syllabus. So what I want you to do with that, with your index card, is just to jot down in your own words a definition for learning objective. Doesn't have to be profound and all that kind of good stuff. We'll come back to this a little later on. So just in your own words, what is a learning objective? So in terms of defining learning objectives, and we're going to come back to these a little later on, but the first thing I want to do is to just kind of look at some learning objectives that I pulled from just some random syllabi online, and just kind of get your take on whether or not you feel like these are good learning objectives. So students will learn how to develop a well-designed argument. So what do we think about that? Good, bad?
The learn is not really measurable.
Correct.
So I would say that would probably not be the best way to state that.
Right, exactly. So that's pretty much the main focus, especially when you're talking about Quality Matters, and just in general, really, that learning objectives are measurable, right? So how would you measure learning? That's, kind of the million-dollar question in general. But that,
To demonstrate.
right, that's not really something that we can measure, right? And it's very subjective. You might measure it in a different way than I measure it. So that's definitely what's wrong with this one, that it's not measurable. The student will demonstrate an understanding of the battles that occurred during the American Revolution, including the battles of Lexington and Concord, the Battle of Quebec, the Battle of Saratoga, and the Battle of Yorktown. So is this better, worse, good, bad? Too much?
I mean, you could just say during
Right.
battles.
So
Name every one of them, 'cause it's kind of overwhelming.
again, we've got this, right, it is overwhelming, right? And again, we've got this kind of subjective understanding. So how are you going to demonstrate this understanding? If I'm a student reading this and it says demonstrate understanding, okay, well, how? And if I demonstrate my understanding for the battles of Lexington and Concord and the Battle of Yorktown, but not Quebec and Saratoga, have I met this objective? So, I mean, but, you know, yes, it's too much, it's overwhelming, it's very broad and not very specific. And again, not measurable because we can't measure someone's understanding of something based on just the word understanding. So this one's a little more tricky. The student will explain the various functions of the endocrine system. So better, worse, good, bad?
Better, it might.
Why better?
It's a little bit more specific, but instead of explain, maybe list would
Right.
be a better thing to put there.
Right.
So
What I was thinking, how are you going to explain?
I agree that it's better, and I also agree that it's better because of the word explain. To me, again, it's still kind of overwhelming. If anybody's familiar with the endocrine system, the functions of it there's like a gajillion of them, right? So, I mean, am I going to explain all of them, or am I just going to explain stuff that goes on with the adrenal glands and the thyroids, or am I going to explain everything? So it's better because it's measurable, but it's still not very specific. It's still very broad, still very overwhelming. So I would say that all of these, you know, this one definitely better, but none of them are very good learning objectives. So some common mistakes, and we just saw several of them. So the number one common mistake is that the objective is not student-centered. And all of these kind of tie back into that. So the 2 through 5 are all kind of related to it not being student-centered. So with this last learning objective, what I mean by it not being student-centered, change the word student to teacher, and you're basically explaining what the teacher's doing, right? The teacher will explain that's what you're going to do. So what do you want the student to do as a result of that? Right, so that's what it means to be student-centered. You're focusing more on the outcome of the student's behavior than you are on what it is that you're doing. And I went back after kind of creating this whole presentation and went back and looked at a lot of my objectives from my syllabus from when I was teaching, and they were all teacher-centered. All of them were. They were all centered on what it was that I was doing. So that's kind of something that you really have to be cognizant of while you're writing your objectives, because it's really easy to do, because it's kind of what you've always done. That's what the objectives that textbooks will give you are most of the time very teacher-centered. They're telling you what it is you're going to be doing as opposed to what it is that the student's going to be doing as a result of that. Not observable or measurable, we talked about that. Uses discipline-specific terminology. Sometimes that's kind of unavoidable, but you know, if you can use a more simple word or more simple phrasing, then always try to, you know, I want to use this phrase, but you know, dumb it down a little bit. They haven't taken this class yet, so when they read these learning objectives, they need to be able to comprehend them and feel comfortable with them and not be overwhelmed. So try not to use, you know, too complicated of verbiage when you're writing these. Too long or overcomplicated, that would be kind of like the one talking about all the battles. And then more than one, you're measuring more than one thing, right? So the student will explain, describe, and analyze. Well, are you going to do all three? What if he only explains and analyzes? Has he met that objective? So if you want 3 different competencies, then that needs to be 3 different objectives, right? I think maybe something like identify and describe probably be okay, but once you get into, you know, explain and analyze, or explain and do 2 or 3 different things, that's a little much.
We can always like compare and contrast, that's good.
Right. Yeah. So this was more of a kind of defining it by looking at what it's not. So let's look at what they are in terms of what we think they are. So anybody want to share your definitions? Volunteers?
I said a guide on what's to be learned.
A guide in what's to be learned. Anybody else?
One student should have knowledge of after working on a topic.
After working on. So what's to be learned and after working on a topic. So we're students focused, right? So my definition is a statement which explicitly communicates to the student precisely what he or she will be able to do or what competencies will be obtained as a result of instruction, right? So after the instruction happens, that's where we're at. And explicitly, precisely, so we're talking about being very specific, very measurable. We don't want to be ambiguous. So a lot of times people kind of get confused between goals and objectives. There is definitely a very distinct difference between goals and objectives. If you were to go to Northwest-Shoals Community College's website and look at their objectives, they would all be very ambiguous, very broad. Something like to serve the greater good of the community and increase economic development, and things of that nature, right? Well, that's okay. How are we going to really measure whether or not we're doing that? And as we go down further, the program goals, the course goals get less and less ambiguous and more specific, or they should. So this is where we're at down here. We're talking about the course and the module level objectives. They're short term as opposed to being long term, specific and measurable. We've talked about that. Things that we can see, and they're not ambiguous, right? They're very clear, easy to understand. I know exactly what it is that you are going to do, and then I know exactly what it is that you want me to be able to do as a result of that. So this is just an acronym that you can use to kind of help remind yourself of all the things that need to be kind of present in a good learning objective. We've talked about these already. Those are kind of ones that are, hopefully intuitive. Maybe not for everybody, but they do need to be specific and measurable. Timely, this kind of goes back to that short-term deal. So for us, that's going to be a semester. That's kind of built into our objectives, semester long. So achievable and realistic. This has to do with making sure that, say for instance, you're teaching an English comp course, like English 101. An objective for that course, a good objective for that course needs to be, it's easier to do a counter example. So a bad objective for English comp would be something like, I want you to write me a 25-page research paper with 10 sources. Right? This is an English Comp 101 class. We need to be writing, essays that are 3 to 5 paragraphs, not 20 to 25 pages. So it needs to be something that's realistically achievable within the time frame that we've set. Right? So consider what class it is that you're teaching. Consider the students that are going to be enrolled in that class, and set objectives for them that are in line with that content and in line with their ability level. All right, so this is kind of the components of how you build a good objective. Now this is really more from corporate and industry. From if you go back and look at like training manuals and things of that nature, this is what you'll see in the corporate world. You take a condition, add a behavior, add a degree, put all that together, and you get your objective. Now, we don't usually do the degree part of it, the with 70% accuracy, because it's, again, built in, right? The degree is passing, right? We want 60% or better, unless maybe you've got something like a national board certification that, you might have some differences with that. But for the most part, especially at a community college where you're talking about first and second year classes, we're all going to be at, 60% or better. That's our degree. I saw this a lot in like developmental stuff that I did. We had a program called RTI, where students that were failing would be put in this program, and they followed the objectives that we would write for those kids would follow this. We want them to be able to do this with 80% accuracy. Once they do it with 80% accuracy, then they move up to the next level in the program. And so with remediation, I've seen that a lot, but in general, you don't really see the whole degree thing being added in. So this is very similar to that, but obviously a little bit different. We don't have the degree here. So upon completion of the module, the student will be able to. That part is usually kind of up at the top of most people's objectives, right? So you don't usually see that with every one of them. So when we're talking about verb, subject, context, it really starts with the word calculate, right? In terms of what the student's going to see when they look down to read it. So your verb gives you something that you can measure, right? That's why we want to use verbs. And you've probably all seen the verbs lists that are correlated to Bloom's taxonomy. So verbs give us something that we can measure. That's why that's there. The subject, this tells the student what's going on, right? So we want to calculate the x-intercept of a quadratic function and then some sort of context, right? Within the course content, how am I going to achieve this? Because there's several ways to calculate an x-intercept, right? So this is extremely specific in that I'm telling you, not only do I want you to calculate the x-intercept, but I want you to do it by factoring, not by graphing and not by using the quadratic function. This particular objective is we want to find it by factoring, right? So if there's multiple ways to do something, we want to make sure that we're being specific to the student in terms of how I want you to be able to do it. Because if they are looking at these, and there's 3 different ways to do it, and you give them a study guide and say, I want you to study, these objectives, well, you just told me I need to find the x-intercept, but then you gave me 5 different ways to find it. So are you testing me on all 5 ways, or are you testing me on what specific ways? This is how I like to write mine, right, with the whole verb, subject, and context idea. So what you need to keep in mind when you're writing these is 2 things. First thing is, what's the cognitive function required for being able to do this? At what level are we on Bloom's, right? And I like this interpretation of Bloom's better because it's not a pyramid. I've never liked the pyramid because it infers that you have to be able to remember before you can understand, and you have to be able to understand before you can apply. And I don't really think that that's true in all instances. So I kind of like this this visualization of Bloom's a little bit better than the traditional. So you want to keep in mind where we're at on this taxonomy, on this hierarchy. And then you also want to keep in mind what type of knowledge it is that you're trying. Hey, all right. What type of knowledge is it that you're after, and is your objective lining up with that, right? So you've got factual knowledge, conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, and metacognitive knowledge. So this is kind of the same. It's very much in line with Bloom's in terms of you've got your most basic terms of understanding something to your most complex. And I have all kind of resources around both of these things. Now, the reason I say that you want to keep both of those things in mind is because by the time that we get done with all of our objectives, we want to have objectives that will be plotted all over this chart, right? We don't want all of our objectives to be right here, factual, conceptual, and on the lower cognitive, right? We want to have some of them here, and some of them here, and a few sprinkled in the middle. Now, if you're teaching a very basic class, like an introductory class, then you're probably going to be skewed somewhat towards this side of the chart, right? Because you're teaching foundational things. You're teaching definitions and facts and procedures in and not analyzing and all that type stuff that you would see at higher level classes. But
Something that's located on the map.
right, exactly. Locations, things of that nature. So you want to try and have a nice spread around the whole chart, but also keep in mind, again, what level your students are at. So you don't want to have really heavy stuff over here with your metacognitive and your create and evaluate if you're in a introductory level course. You want to have some stuff over here, definitely, but the majority of your stuff is probably going to be from the middle to the left, right? And again, I have lots of resources pertaining to this stuff. If y'all want anything, just let me know. This is what I was referring to earlier with one of the Bloom's verb lists, right? There's actually also, I don't know if y'all knew, there's a revised versions of Bloom's that was revised in 2001. So they changed all of the words to verbs instead of nouns. And then there's also a digital taxonomy, a Bloom's digital taxonomy, a guy named Churches. I can't remember his first name. I think that was done in like 2010 or so, something like that. But there has been many updates to the original Bloom's taxonomy, which I think was in 1956. So I say that to say that you can find some updated versions of this. I don't know, how old, if you do have one of these lists, there's lots of updated versions of that. And then since the digital taxonomy was created, there's actually, verb lists that are just specific to that taxonomy. So the reason I have this up here now is because on the other side of your index card, I want you to think about a course that you're teaching right now and either create an objective or revise a current objective that you have, or just maybe list one that you know is really good. So I'm going to set 2 pieces of paper in front of you and just leave them turned face down for me. So what was your objective, Brian?
Calculate the value of a function.
Calculate the
Value.
value of a function. So where would you place that on this chart?
Column 3.
So you're going to say apply, and if we're calculating the value of a function, I'd say that's probably, we could probably put that in both of those places. And, that's going to happen sometimes. You will have objectives that will take up more than one slot. Let's see. The student will be able to calculate the x-intercepts. That'd probably be about the same spot, right? Apply and procedural for the one that we were looking at earlier. What about Todd? What do you got?
I had using a hyperbolic mannequin, do CPR with rated death.
So you're talking about doing CPR. That would be procedural and probably applying again, right? I would say. I don't know. Where would you put it?
That's what I was looking at, I think.
Yeah, right there. What about you, Diane? What do you got?
I said after successfully completing this course, the student will plan and evaluate a developmentally appropriate lesson plan.
Plan and evaluate a developmentally appropriate lesson plan. So where would you place that on the chart here?
Well, they would have to understand, apply, and create, I would think. Because
Right.
they would have to understand what developmentally appropriate is, they would have to apply it, and they would have to create the plan.
Right. So it might be that we need to split that into 2 objectives then. And kind of the telltale sign for that is exactly what just happened there. If you have one objective that you feel like goes here and here with the understand and the create, then you could probably break that into 2 objectives, right? Because most of the time, objectives, if they are in more than one box, the box is going to be pretty close together, right? But I agree with you, though. They would have to understand and then create. So you might want to do plan as one objective and then create as another objective. What about you, Ms. Pearson?
Call me
Selena? I was not sure that I remembered your first name correctly, so I didn't want to call you by your first name and then it'd be wrong.
That's
So,
all right. Well, the first one I wrote down was just basically be able to locate places on a world map, but
Mhm.
very low. And so I started thinking of something else that, I don't know if I did it when you were there, but
Mhm.
we watched full videos
uh-huh.
about different subject matters. And this one is like being able to evaluate persons' living conditions.
Somebody that's in the video?
Mhm.
Okay.
By the type of structure that they live in.
Okay.
So, you know, if they're living in a slum,
Right.
then their living conditions are very poor.
So I would say that's definitely up at the higher end.
Yeah, I would say
Um,
analyze.
and you kind of divide these into lower order thinking skills and higher order, right? Your bottom three are your lower order, and your top three are higher. I would say probably at least analyze, if not evaluate. And that's going to be probably down here with metacognitive, I would think. I mean, that's just my perception of it. So we've got all this great stuff, about blooms and how to write it, and your cognitive function and your knowledge domain and all of this. So why do I want to spend the time to make sure that I have a specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound objective? Why does this matter to me? So before we get into that, I have kind of a little activity here that I hope will somewhat illustrate to you the power of objectives. So don't turn anything over yet. Let me get my timer set. So you've got two, stopwatch would be better. You have two sheets of paper. On one sheet of paper, you have a list of 15 words. On the other sheet of paper, you have 15 blanks. Okay? So when I say go, I want you to flip those over, and I want you to count all of the vowels and all of the 15 words. Okay? And then when we get done with that, I'll tell you what the next part of it is. Yes, you can turn both of them over because you won't know which one the words are on. Okay, so count all the vowels and all 15 words. Okay, you got 45 seconds. Go. All right, flip the paper with the words on it over to where you can't see it. I want you to write down as many of the words as you can from that sheet of paper. Just to make you feel better, when I did it, I got 0 with that. So you got, you tied with me for 0. You got 2, 3. Todd, how many you got?
I don't know if they're all correct.
All right, so before you flip the paper back over and start checking your answers, so we're going to do it again, right? I want you to take just 10 seconds or so and look at the words, and this time I want you to just see if you can figure out some sort of organizing principle that in the way that the words are listed. All right, now flip that sheet of paper with the words on it over, and on the other side, I want you to list as many of the words as you can. How many did you get? 7? How many did you get the first time? 2. How many did you get this time, Brian? 7 versus none. What about you, Diane?
I think I got 1, 2, 3, 4.
Y'all can check them. We're done. Y'all can check and see how many you got.
10, but
Got
I
10?
think yeah.
What about you, Todd? 10? So we didn't get anything more than, 3 or so the first time, and we got from 7 to 10 the second time. I went from 0 to 12 when I did it. So what was it? Why was it easier the second time?
Because we knew what we were supposed to do.
You were
Right.
concentrating on the words and not just parts. It
Right.
makes it more meaningful when you concentrate
Right.
on the full word.
And also, I kind of told you, gave you a little hint when I said look for an organizing principle, right? So what was the organizing principle? They were all related to numbers, right? So each of them was, did you not catch that? So look at them now.
What happened to 7?
Oh, did I might have missed one.
What's
Yep.
Valentine's Day the 4th?
There was supposed to be 7 Up on there after 6-pack, so that was a typo on my part. So on the one hand, I intentionally misled you the first time, right? I told you to count the vowels when I knew that I was going to be asking you to give me the words, right? So we kind of do the same thing on accident without even realizing it sometimes to our students, right? So when you tell them read chapter 1, you know what you're going to ask them to do after that. You know exactly what it is that you want them to get out of it, but you just say read chapter 1. So to them, that might mean I need to look at every word that is in chapter 1. And if I do that, if I look at the word and read it, then I've done what I'm supposed to do, right? When that's not anywhere close to really what it is that you're wanting them to get out of it. When you assign a math problem and you say, or a set of homework, and you say, do problem set 1, complete the problem set. To the vast majority of the students, they're going to think if I complete every problem and get the right answer, I've done what I'm supposed to do. They have no idea that it's more procedural, and you want to know that they understand the underlying concepts of why it is that they're doing what it is that they're doing, right? So it's just really to kind of illustrate to you the power of being specific in telling you what it is I want out of what you're doing right now, right? So yes, I intentionally misled you. You kind of do the same thing though without even realizing it sometimes. When you give directions or when you give objectives to your students that are ambiguous, right? You're not trying to mislead them, but they don't know what you want unless you tell them, right? And we all know that you have got to be very specific. Otherwise, you're going to repeat yourself and repeat yourself and repeat yourself, and they're not going to understand what you're saying anyway. And then you're going to repeat yourself some more, right? So, always enjoyed repeating myself. That was great. So this is just a couple of quotes that I found that I really that resonated with me in terms of learning objectives and kind of how they fit into the overall picture of designing a course. Only after desired results and appropriate evidence of learning are specified can planners think effectively about instructional experiences and approaches, which I interpret as saying I can't really think about what to do to help you unless I know where I'm trying to get you to, right? If I'm going to go on a trip, I first have to decide where it is that I'm going before I put it in my GPS and start getting my turn-by-turn navigation. Right? I need to have a destination in mind before I map out a plan to get there, right? And then once I have my destination, I would much rather have my GPS, which is super specific and tells me go down here 0.3 miles and take a left, and then go 6.3 miles and take a right, versus stopping at a convenience store and asking Jim Bob, and him saying, well, just go on down there to the 7-Eleven and hang you a left. And so you want specific versus, Jim Bob. And you want to know where you're going so you can have an idea of how you want to try to get there. And then it's not about measuring as much as it is defining what you're trying to measure. This, for me, was kind of my aha moment when I heard this lady. So this Laura Gogia, I think is how it's pronounced. I don't think she even actually has any teaching experience. She has an MD and a PhD, and she is an educational consultant, but I don't think she's ever actually spent time in the classroom. But she does a lot of consulting with faculty. And in the overall scheme of planning, when you have your objectives and you go through this process of where does it fall on Bloom's and where does it fall in the knowledge domain and and I want to make sure that I've got everything spread out evenly on this chart, where I've got some lower order thinking skills measured and some higher order thinking skills measured. Once I have those objectives and I've thought very critically about what they are and how I've created them, then it makes it a lot easier for me once I go in and start thinking about assessment and evidence of learning and instructional strategies and instructional materials. It makes it much easier to get all of this stuff aligned and to go out and seek out the resources for assessment and the resources for instruction, because I've put all of this time and effort and cognition into writing these objectives. I personally, have a better understanding of my course and what it is that I'm trying to get out of my students when I go through this process. So for me, it's not necessarily about making sure that I have these wonderful objectives that probably half the students are going to look at and the other half are not. It's more of having the process of creating the objectives and how that fits into the overall larger scheme of the course design process. So the benefits of having great objectives. For your students, it gives them a clear purpose. They know exactly what it is that they're doing. They know that, once they get done, they're going to be asked to list all the words and not just how many vowels they counted, right? They know what it is that's expected of them. They can monitor their progress, and it communicates to them that you've spent some time doing some things for the course, right? That you've planned it and organized it, which, trust me, is important to them. For you, like I just said, it's going to guide your selection for content, and it's going to guide the overall planning process. It's going to help you select your assessment and your instructional strategies, and it provides a mechanism for you to align all of these components together, right? When you go through the process of writing these objectives, following kind of the verb, subject, context format, and then you go through the thought process of where does it fall on Bloom's and what kind of knowledge is it that I'm trying to measure, and you do that for every module in your course, then you're just naturally, as a consequence of that, going to have a much better idea of your own course and what it is that you really are trying to get out of your students. And this is how it fits into the overall picture, right? So this is called backwards design. It's called backwards design because we start with the learning objectives, right? Which are the outcomes. So we start with the outcomes. What do we want to get out of it? And then once we've defined our outcomes, we ask ourselves, okay, what are they going to show me that tells me that they have met this outcome, which would be the assessment, right? The evidence of learning. And then once we've determined that, the last step is, okay, well, how am I going to prepare them to give me that evidence? So it goes objectives, then assessments, and then the last thing that we do is look at instructional strategies, which is kind of backwards, right, from the way that we normally do things. I know for me, the way that I normally did things was I started with content, and then what instructional strategies line up with this content the best. And then the objectives were just kind of, it was one of two things. It was either the last thing that I thought about, or it was just what the textbook gave me, right? And I'm not saying, that it's a eternal sin to use objectives from textbooks. Some of them are good. But we have this great and awful thing called academic freedom, right, in higher education. It's wonderful, and it's also kind of a burden at the same time. Like with great power comes great responsibility. You have academic freedom to teach whatever you want, for the most part. So you can take those textbook objectives and kind of mold them a little bit, maybe trim the fat a little bit. That's not necessarily very important for them to go on to the next course or whatever. You know your content better than anyone. And so, take your academic freedom and use it, and determine what you feel like is important to learn. But I wanted to show you this just because this kind of ties into the next two sessions. So we'll actually kind of talk about this part of it, the second and third steps, both in the next session, and then the last session is kind of what happens after. So, all right, so we have about 10 minutes left, which is not as much time as I wanted. Might go over a little bit. I'll try to get through this quicker. It's a shorter part anyway. So now we're going to talk about the learner-centered syllabus. I found this comic when I was looking for images, and I felt like everyone would be able to relate to that, because I know that you can all relate to that. But anyways, it doesn't really have anything to do with learner-centered syllabus. It's just a nice image to transition us. So syllabus in the traditional context, we all kind of know what the traditional components are. You've got your instructor information, your course description, your course objectives, a course schedule, all of those things that are going to be on. If you were to go and Google, syllabus template, then all of those things that are going to be on there. And so a learner-centered syllabus is going to have all of those things. It's going to have all of those same components. So the purpose of a traditional syllabus, if you look at the literature, this is overwhelmingly what you'll find. Serves as a contract, serves as a record, serves as a cognitive map. A contract in that you have policies, right? You've got institutional policies, and then you've got your own policies. It serves as a record both for the institution to be able to evaluate you, for you to keep your own records, and then a lot of times students will keep these for their records. I've kept every syllabus from every class I've ever had, because that's just the kind of person that I am. And then the cognitive map portion of it, right? So this is really the meat and potatoes of it. This is what's the course look like? What's the purpose of the course? How's it structured? What kind of assignments are you going to have? It gives the students an idea of how the course is going to go. It gives them an idea of you. And again, the learner-centered syllabus still serves all these purposes. So the learner-centered syllabus, and I'm just going to start calling it LC because learner-centered is really hard to say, is really more about, it's a nuanced type deal, right? So it's kind of about taking what you already have and just altering it to focus more on the learner than you're focusing on yourself. And for the most part, you probably don't sit down and say, I'm going to write this syllabus and I'm not going to focus on the learner at all. I'm just going to focus it on me. Nobody sits down and intentionally does that. But I'll show you some examples of an LC syllabus here in a minute, and you'll kind of see what I'm saying. So especially with online classes, this is our first opportunity to make a good impression on our students. And I want to say it's 53% of all first generation and first year students start at community college. So if you have a first year, first generation student, then your syllabus might be the very first formal academic document that they ever see at the college level. So just keep that in mind as you put your syllabus out there. Are you comfortable with knowing that this might be the very first document that they see and will set the tone for their entire college career, right? So we want to make sure that we're setting a good tone and that we're making a good impression with this syllabus. So a learner-centered syllabus requires that you shift from what you are going to cover to a concern more for the tools and the information that the learner will need. And this is, again, very nuanced, right? Which can be tedious when you're talking about things that are kind of ambiguous and nuanced. It can be tedious to do it, but the research on this is very convincing and very unanimous that learner-centered syllabus or syllabi do have very positive effects on our students in terms of their perception of the instructor, the retention of students in class, and their overall satisfaction with the class, which is kind of crazy that a syllabus can have that much of a difference. So in a study by these guys, the ones that I just quoted, so they did a study where they looked at a collection of learner LC syllabi and traditional. Now these were designated by the instructors themselves. Okay? So these syllabi were, we have a group of people saying my syllabus is learner-centered, and then a group of people saying my syllabus is traditional. So then they looked at all of these, and these were the most overlapping elements that they found in the syllabi that were defined as being learner-centered. So positive language, enthusiasm, compassion, humor, self-disclosure, these are not things that you normally find in those traditional syllabi that we were talking about before, right? Where you've got your course description and all this stuff. This is not so common in a traditional syllabus. And when I say self-disclosure, this means letting them into your personal life a little bit, however much you're comfortable with, you know. Somehow letting them know what your hobbies are, or what you like, or what your favorite musical genre is, things that are important to you. So we use all of these things to really do three main things. So there's really three main components that we're after with a learner-centered syllabus. The first one is that we want to build a sense of community. Now, students are not going to respond well to this because it's unnatural for them, because for their entire educational career, they've been programmed that the person standing up here has all the knowledge and all the answers, right? And I'm going to expel upon you all of my wisdom, and that is that. They've never really been a part of a learning community where they have to take an active role in that, and their opinions and their input is valued, right? So that's something that we want to, now obviously you can't achieve that with the syllabus, but you can communicate your desire to do so in the syllabus by using positive language and humor and being accessible and being approachable and doing all of these things. So we want to shift from this idea of a dualistic definition in the classroom of me having all the answers and giving you all the information to more of a relative type atmosphere where your perspective is as important as my perspective, and we're kind of constructing an experience of learning together. Much easier said than done, I know, especially when you have people that are going to resist it, but that's with any kind of change. So this is an example of, on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see a traditional syllabus, and on the right-hand side, you've got a learner-centered. This is a guy that looked at the research from the people I was quoting a few slides ago, and based on their research, he redesigned his syllabus. So, you know, when I say nuanced, right, there's not a lot of difference here. You still have all of this, all of the things that you have on the left-hand side are over here on the right-hand side. You have some extra stuff. You know, I think this Selly thing is similar to Remind, a Twitter handle, but it's this right here, right? Or just come on by. That's the part of it that's the learner-centered part, right? And you think, well, that's, you know, that's nothing, and that's kind of silly. Yes, it is, but things like that make a tremendous difference, right? Over here we have by appointment only. No students will ever come see this guy. Nobody's ever going to go see him. If he has that where it says by appointment only, nobody's ever going to come see him. And probably very, very few are ever going to come see him with this. But it sets the idea in their head of what kind of person he is and what kind of instructor he is, right? Think about every experience you've ever had with customer service on the telephone. Were they good or not good? Right? Have you ever had a good experience with customer service on the telephone? I have. I've had like 2. And both times, it was just their tone of voice, and you could just tell they were smiling through the telephone, you know? And I got off the phone, and I was like, man, you know what? That was just a good experience. Right. Exactly. But, you know, just the little things like that. Just, you know, that's the equivalent of smiling over the telephone, right? He's even got a little smiley face right there. And little things like that they can make a huge difference in the perception that your students are going to have of you.
But just as an aside here, because I like to do that, and
Mhm.
even when I'm doing communication back and forth, maybe an email, and of course, but then again, sometimes I think, well, is that
Unprofessional, right?
And
Yeah.
so I kind of question myself when I start, you know, should I be doing that?
Right.
So I guess, and the students are texting us and sending us email, though is THO, you
Right.
know, and so it's a lot less formal than it ever was when I was in school.
Definitely, yes.
So it's a totally different atmosphere when you're communicating
Mhm.
now.
I agree.
So, you know, if we're gonna go to that, I think we need to, maybe everybody needs to understand that it is a little less
Oh, yeah.
professional.
It is. It's much
we're
more
used to.
much more relaxed. And
Exactly.
I don't necessarily, you know, there's parts of that are good and parts of that are not so good. I feel like you just kind of have to let your own personality, you know, shine through. And
And I usually do and don't worry about
Right.
it, but I have before, I have kind of questioned, you know, I'd put a smiley face and then I'd take it off.
Right.
Because I think,
Yeah.
you know, is that really?
well, I think the
Did I
fact
put a
that,
smiley
you know,
face?
the fact that you're thinking about that kind of stuff, I mean, tells me that you're probably doing what you need to be doing. So if you're considering those type things, then I think you're probably okay. But in general, just, yeah, it's much less professional. But, you know, I mean, that's the case even in graduate school. You know, I'm still working on my doctorate, and the rapport between the students and the professors in all of my classes is very casual. You know, most of them don't like to be called doctor and then their last name. Some of them will just tell you to call them by their first name. Some of them will tell you, call me, you know, Dr. Frankie or whatever, and which is kind of weird for me. But it is what it is. It's where we're at today. So I said there was 3 things, right? So the second thing is, and this is going to be the hardest one for you, and I know it because I just do. So we want to set new parameters for power and control in the classroom. Relinquishing control is not something that teachers are good at. You know, in general, teachers are those people that were always the assertive people on the playground, and they, you know, organized the kids together when there was going to be some sort of game and said, you're on this team, and that's just in our nature. You know, we kind of take control, and we like to be in control, and we do well being in control. But, and I'm not saying relinquish all your control and just tell them do whatever they want to do. But if you will at least invite their input and give them the opportunity to have some input into how the course is structured, then it will do wonders in terms of their engagement in the class, and again, their perception of you. And their perception of you does matter. That will affect the level of effort that they put into things. If they don't like you, they're not going to try very hard for you. They're just not. If they think you're a grump and you know, just a Scrooge in general, they're not going to do. They might do the bare minimum, and that's about it. So, and you know, you want to require them to be actively involved. And I know a lot of times you'll think, man, I require them to do whatever. They're not going to do it. They tend to rise or fall to the bar that is set, right? If I set the bar up here, the majority of them are gonna get up there. Now they might do the bare minimum to meet that requirement, but if the requirement is set up here, then let them do the bare minimum. I've set my expectations so high that if you do the bare minimum, then we're good, right? Now you're always going to have your slackers, but if you set the bar down here, they're still going to meet the expectation. Those same ones that would have met your expectation up here are going to meet your expectation down here. So you set the bar high and let them rise to it, and they will. I promise you they will. So again, going back to this same guy, here is his original syllabus, and then his revised syllabus to be more learner-centered, which was the last bullet point on the slide of defining roles, right? So not just telling them what you expect them to do, but telling them what they can expect from you, right? So, if you want them to be active and participate in class, then you need to be active in facilitating class. If you want them to be comfortable taking risks, then you need to create an environment in which it is okay for them to take risks and fail. If you want them to be prepared for class, then you need to be prepared for class. So have very clear, defined roles, not just for them, but for you as well, and then communicate that to them. This is what I want you to do. This is what I expect you to do. This is what you can expect for me to do. So in doing my research for this, I came across an article that a sociology professor wrote. She actually allowed her students, the first assignment for the class was for them to write the assignments for the class. So, and I'm not saying that that's something that you should do, but that was something that this particular instructor felt like was a good idea. And she said that her assignments were not really all that different than when she let the students create them. They weren't all that different than the ones that she created. They, because they're kind of trained of this is kind of the way things go. So she gave them a little guidance, gave them a little sheet to fill out, some resources to go online and look at. But by and large, they kind of came up with the same assignments that she would have came up with anyway. And then they performed better on them because they were the ones that had set those expectations, right? So when they have ownership over it, they're going to be more invested in it, right? If I've set my own expectations, then I'm going to feel worse about failing because I'm the one that said I was going to do it, right? I created this thing and now I'm not going to do it. They will take more ownership of their learning if you allow them to have a say-so in their learning. I'm not saying you need to let them come up with all their own assignments, but there's always ways to relinquish a little bit of control. One of my professors let us weight the different categories. Now she told us this has to count the most, but that was it. She didn't say how much, by how much, but we had different categories, and she let us weight things. And then throughout the semester, every class period, the first thing that we did was we revisited the syllabus and talked about if there was any changes that wanted to be made or needed to be made. It was just something that was kind of an ongoing, flexible, it was a contract, but it was a flexible contract. So there's different ways that you can go about it. You're going to have to decide where you're willing to give up some control, right? Because there's some things that you're not going to. There's some non-negotiables where you're going to say this is the way it's going to be and that's it. But there's always going to be some areas where you can relinquish a little bit of control. So just figure out what those are for you. So then the last thing is you want to be very explicit about communicating both what types of evaluation and assessment are going to happen, when they're going to happen, and how they are aligned overall in the course structure. How are they aligned to the objectives? How are they aligned with the instructional strategies that you've chosen? You want to have as much of a variation as possible. I know with certain disciplines and with certain courses, it's sometimes harder to have a variation in assessment, but you can always have at least some variation, right? Do some discussions, do some multiple choice, do some fill in the blank. Where it's possible, have them do group work if you're in a traditional setting. But just vary it as much as possible. But again, it's a balancing act, because you don't want to say, well, I'm going to use this assessment strategy so I can make it to 8 different strategies that I'm using in this course. Don't just use an assessment strategy just so you can say, well, that makes another one that I'm able to do. You want to look at your objectives and think what assessment strategies best align with what I'm doing. So get as much variation as you can, but don't have variation just for the sake of having variation. And then allow for revisions and resubmissions. This does not mean, letting them retake a test or, take tests multiple times, but count off some points. Allow for late work, but penalize them for it. But do allow for revisions and resubmissions. That for me was one thing that I had a hard time coming to grips with, because I felt like, we've got deadlines and I need to teach you responsibility and you need to have stuff turned in on time. But you know what? I miss deadlines from time to time.
And your point is to teach them what you're wanting them to learn.
Right.
So, to me, that revision and resubmission is much better than just saying, no, you can't get it in, or,
Yeah.
or whatever, because you're wanting them to
Right.
learn that.
So if you tell them it's due Monday, and if it's not here Monday at 8 o'clock and that's it, and then you cut it off, well, you think they're going to go Monday at 8:30 and learn it on their own? No. So I agree completely. Our end goal here is that they learn the material. If we don't allow for revisions and resubmissions, then they're not going to if they miss that initial deadline. So this is an example of a rationale for one of his assignments in the traditional syllabus. So you can see in his learner-centered syllabus, he still has verbatim that same statement, right? So all that he's done is basically, number one, he's communicated to them how this is aligned to the learning objectives that were stated earlier in the syllabus, right? So that's what that SLOs 1 and 2, stated learning objectives 1 and 2. So he's saying this assignment is going to help you achieve the whatever it is that was stated in objectives 1 and 2. And then he's giving them a rationale behind it. Instead of just saying, this is what you're going to do, this is how you're going to do it, this is when you're going to turn it in, he's saying, within the overall context of this course, this is why I'm asking you to do this, this is why I feel like it's important for you to do this, and this is how it's going to be beneficial to you, right? You have that in your head already. If you don't, you probably should.
And I tell them in my classroom class,
Right.
verbally, but online, you don't have that opportunity.
Right,
So if you've got it in your syllabus,
right.
then
And again,
you don't have to worry about that.
this goes back to what I was saying earlier with the, it's not so much about measuring as it is defining what you're trying to measure. If you don't already have that in your head, then you probably need to, right? So just the simple act of sitting down and putting it in your syllabus is going to benefit you as much as it's going to benefit them, right? Because they're not all going to read that. A lot of them will. And the more research I looked at, the more surprised I became, because it was the longer and the more detailed the syllabus was, the better the students received it. And I would have thought that would have been the opposite. I would figure that they would want a 1 to 2 page syllabus. But according to the research, the longer it was and the more detailed that it was, the more that they perceived the instructor, how was it that it was put, as having master teacher qualities.
And telling you exactly what they expect.
Mhm.
I mean, even I think about in my classes, you know, if you only got a syllabus that just stated what you already knew,
Right.
it's not helping you. But if it's detailed, then
Right.
okay, now I know exactly what they expect. So,
And especially for your higher achieving students, this, you know, tying the alignment to it, where you're telling them exactly, all right, this is what I want you to do, and then here's the assignment that's going to help you do it. Now, I'm the type student that I would be the one that would go in and look at that kind of stuff, you know, and it would help me. A lot of them won't, but you know, it's going to benefit you, and it will benefit a good, decent percentage of your students. Learner-centered syllabi have a positive impact on student perceptions of instructors. They perceive their instructors as more creative, approachable, effective at communicating. So this is going back to the research that I was just telling you about. There was another research study that dealt with the perception of student and instructor rapport. So online students that were looking at learner-centered syllabi were perceiving these instructors that they have never met as having a better rapport with their students and being more engaged with their students by just solely based on this piece of paper, you know. And there's other research that kind of ties in with that, that says, you know, if a student perceives their instructors as having better rapport, then they're much more likely to persist. They're much more likely to be retained and graduate. So the perception part of it is, this is just my opinion, and the research backs this up, is as important as the content part of it. Just the fact that we are putting out the perception of being learner-centered and inviting their input, even if they don't take advantage of the opportunities that we give them in terms of contributing their opinions and their perspectives in class. The simple fact that we've communicated these things to them does make a significant difference in their perception of the overall course. And that is all.